Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Guam people, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture. I'm your host, Alexandria Miller, and I'm so excited to share this episode with you. It's one I've had in mind for a while now. If you have been following our podcast episodes throughout the summer, you probably heard one that I shared a little bit earlier, talking about some of the scariest places to visit in the Caribbean and some of the lore and legends surrounding them. I spoke about river mumas or mermaids, that sometimes live under Flat Bridge as the lore goes, or in Tobago's legend of the flying Gang Gang Sarah, just to name a few. So one thing that I know is true when it comes to the region is that our stories of myth and legends can done. So joining the show today to discuss Caribbean myths, legends, and folklore is writer, journalist, voice actor, fellow podcaster, and so much more, Amanda Alcántara. Thank you so much for joining our show, Amanda. It's a pleasure to have you. Please let everybody know a little bit about yourself, where in the Caribbean, of course, is near and dear to you, and how you got started and inspired to do your work on Caribbean myths and legends.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm also super excited to be here, super excited to be talking to you and to be a part of your podcasting journey and your podcasting platform. Yeah, my name is Amanda. I am a writer and a journalist, a poet, and I started a podcast in Spanish, Radio Místico, in 2021. When I moved to the Dominican Republic, I actually moved to the Dominican Republic in September of 2020, right? You know, in the middle of the pandemic when all of our lives were all over the place. And yeah, I really was inspired to do a podcast on myths and legends because of my own sort of spiritual journey. When I moved to the Dominican Republic, it was in search of something. I couldn't really say what at the time. At the time I thought it was like in search of peace. I thought it was in search of family, in search of like my own roots and my own history. And I think that is still true. And now that I've been here for about 3 years, I realized I was in search of myself because I was raised here. And I think I just needed to reconnect with who I was before we get into our careers and we get into our the things that they tell us define us. Ironically, sometimes they can separate us from who we are. So I came back and I realized, there really was a gap when it came to podcasting and general storytelling from the Caribbean, from the Dominican and, Spanish speaking Caribbean, and in Spanish, right? Because I think, when you think of this Latina culture that Spanish speaking people are a supposed part of, that's a whole other conversation. But, when you think of that realm, even then, there isn't a lot of representation of Caribbean stories within that sphere as well. And then, honestly, I also just got into conspiracy theories, and I noticed that they were so filled with like white supremacy and like MAGA and just all of this sad, angry, white angst that does not define me at all. Just full on racism, full on sexism. And I realized, we do also have our own conspiracy theories too that aren't necessarily so out there and that actually honor who we are as opposed to adhering to like anti-blackness.
I think that point, thinking about who we are and how these myths and legends even shape not only our upbringings, but how we feel connected to our past is one that even I think is a great starting point for our conversation today. Before even, really delving into the connections of those histories to who we are, right? I think a great place for us to start is just thinking about the sheer number, right, of legends and characters that are part of the folklore that make up the Caribbean. Of course, we are a very diverse region, right, with islands, nations. Some of us are still colonized. There's as I've had several of these conversations, right, on the podcast, even throwing in migration in there, right? There are several things that make up who we are, and all of those things together obviously will naturally create distinctions, right? So one place may call, a particular myth one thing, and another place may call it something else. But I think in a lot of ways, there are also some significant similarities across the regions that sometimes we don't think of, particular to our folklore. So, what are some of the similarities that you've seen just, in your studies of Caribbean folklore, and where do you think the origins of these similarities stem from?
Yeah, I think in general, myths and folklore and all of the legends and the stories that exist within them, I think they are a function of telling the story of who we are, right? So basically, there's like a general story of people of the world, every country just based on their own history, their own culture, etc., kind of takes this myth and this sort of subconscious story and really makes it their own. And when I think of the Caribbean, one of the most beautiful examples that I can think of is Juve. Well, basically, with Juve, I think that's a wonderful example of something that happens in every single, not every single, but happens in so many of our carnivals, and every single place adds its own little meaning, its own story. I did an episode for Radio Místico also on witches, and I think witches are such a, I don't want to say simple, but well known way of taking on this question of myth, and how every single place just adds its own story. And depending on who's telling that story, what you're going to get. For, a Black candomblé practitioner in Brazil, a witch is someone who is powerful, someone who is independent. For a man in some other place, a witch is someone to be feared, someone to be burnt at the stake. And for me, witches are powerful. I am a witch, but that's what I mean. Like every place really takes the myth and it informs the subconscious of that particular region, that particular locality, down to like a neighborhood, right? Down to a different campo. Um, Here, for example, I noticed that in order to be true to the myths of the Dominican Republic, I have to be okay with stories not being straightforward and with having different versions of the same thing. Um, and with stories also not being like super easy to pack into a podcast, because when we're thinking of podcast production, it would be wonderful if it was like, oh, there's this story of this woman that she comes out at night and she flies. And it's like, no, there's people here that say, yeah, she uses a broom. And then when you go to another campo, they say, oh, no, she is the devil made woman. And to me, that it's a way of informing the subconscious of that place, and sometimes the ugliness too. Sometimes it tells the story of the ugliness of a place, the patriarchy, the patriarchal like factors of a place. It's been fascinating, and honestly, it's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun to just go out there and interview people.
I think that was a really dope point that you made in the fact that, these myths can even be so small as to like pinpoint a particular neighborhood. Even that same episode that I was referring to on some of the scariest places in the Caribbean, the legend of Gang Sarah in Tobago. I've heard various versions of this story, right? Depending on who you're asking, where they're from, from which generation they heard this from. There are a variety of factors that really factor into um the way that these stories continue to be made part of not only our lore, but really, to your point, who we are. And in my view, a great foundational point for just understanding that, yes, while sometimes they may seem silly or, there are stories that, I've heard in my family that I'm like, oh, I don't, I can't even deal with this one again, or like, you're even wondering like how much of this is fact, right? I think oftentimes we get too focused on what is fact versus what is fiction, but the truth of the matter is there are parts of every story, right, whether they're myths or not, that can be fact or fiction or, are fact or fiction, but it's really the grounding, and to me, the, like, sort of ancestral presence and, um, future guiding principles in a way that I find important in terms of just how we are paying tribute to these stories in our present and futures.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
I think that even brings me to another point that I was thinking about in terms of the myths, especially not being exactly the same. These are stories, as we mentioned, that have been passed down through generations, though not always. But, sometimes they serve a deeper, higher purpose, right? Beyond just us, grounding ourselves in our history. What in your expertise and, through your interviews have you come across in terms of how these stories what have they been, instructed on in terms of teaching us or, have we been supposed to gain from them?
Yeah, I'm gonna take this opportunity to talk about La Ciguapa, which was the first episode that I did for Radio Místico. Just because I think it really captures the sentiment of your question, which is that yeah, these stories are fun, sometimes they're fiction and they have personality and they can be very out there, but they really do capture the archetypes that move a society. And they really do capture like the history of a society. And the Siguapa for me is a wonderful example of that. So basically, this is a myth that I've heard about since I was a little kid here in the Dominican Republic. And it's of this woman that she comes out at night and she haunts men. Depending on who you ask, she haunts them, she eats them, she, you know, takes them away and kidnaps them. She scares them. She's not scary at all. She's like alluring. But the one thing that is constant in all of the examples is that her feet are backwards. So her feet are pointing backwards, right? And if you read the stories of the time about La Ciguapa, because so much of the written text is by the colonizers, they will tell you that she is, this short Indian, and they use, this word Indian, meaning indigenous, probably Taino, right, which were the original people of the Dominican Republic and Haiti, Hispaniola. Um, they say all of these things from a very patriarchal point of view. That is, she's this short woman that is alluring and that captures your attention and she lures you away, almost like a mermaid, right? It's kind of like these archetypes repeat themselves throughout different parts of the world. And then there are the very sort of Taino centric people, right, which is part of a movement to reclaim Taino identity, who say that this was a Taino woman, plain and simple. And then, I interviewed this woman that she is a singer and an artist here in Santiago, and she goes by Siguapa. So I wanted to interview her about why she decided to adopt that name. And she is a proud Black woman. And I know it's silly to say that, but in the Dominican Republic, it's important to say when somebody is proud of their Blackness, unfortunately. But she is this proud Black woman, and she said that basically she didn't have her feet backwards, but rather, she was a maroon woman and she would walk back to their hiding place backwards so that her steps wouldn't be traced. So everyone kind of projects their own thing onto this story. And I think that that is what myths and legends really do. They capture the archetypes that really inform the energy of a place, even when a place doesn't want to be honest about its story or about how it views itself. You know, the myths that the people from that place tell really do let you know the sentiments of the people, right? Like, okay, the mermaid, for example, there is Yemaya, and there is, this depiction of a mermaid as a goddess. And then there is this depiction of a mermaid as someone who And here comes the story again, haunts men, eats men, etc. Right? So clearly whoever tells the story has the power here. Um, but I do think we are in a time where people are also starting to have discernment, and like some of the not so patriarchal side of these stories, at least when it comes to women, is coming out.
I'm glad you brought up La Ciguapa, especially because I've noted even some of the similarities between that story and the story of La Diablesse, which very similar, is supposed to be the archetype of this woman who also haunts men, right? I think there are, and this is like when you start reading the stories very particularly, you come across obviously the similarities, right? So both characters are supposed to like haunt slash eat men depending on who you're asking, right? But then there's the difference, whereas I think the story goes for La Diablesse, it's that she has like a cow foot or something like that, which she hides, right? Whereas for La Ciguana, it is that she walks backwards, right? And so you come
That her
across
feet are like
are
backwards.
yeah, that her feet are backwards. And so you
Yeah,
come
yeah.
across all of these just like novel pieces of the story that, just in maybe hearing it, right? You might not even fully understand the context, right? If you weren't familiar about, the just significant maroon populations across the Caribbean, for one, right? You wouldn't even consider the fact that that's maybe why in the story, quote unquote, her feet are backwards, right? As opposed to the actual sort of like liberatory, you know, way of her not being able to be tracked back to the maroons' homelands, right? And so
Yeah,
there are
that's
so
oh
many ways. Go.
no, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. It's just that is fascinating. The fact that there's that feet factor there, especially because did she carry cow feet maybe as protection? Because then that would kind of match with her walking backwards.
Mm.
I don't know. It's almost like that telephone game where by the time we get it, every place has its own flair to it.
But also to the point of lessons, right? Like, I always am going to firstly point to Anansi the spider when I think of things that, some of these folklores or these lessons are supposed to, sometimes supposed to teach us, right? So for our listeners who may not be familiar, Anansi is another character of Caribbean folklore, and I would actually even venture to say Black diasporic folklore, because Anansi isn't necessarily particular to the Caribbean. That story stems from West Africa and the Akan people, but long and short of the story is Anansi the spider, is known as a trickster, oftentimes plays tricks, but is also a beacon of wisdom and knowledge. And most of the times, for the stories that he's a part of, there is often a lesson, some sort of like moral principle that is to be gained, right? And so there are ways that, sometimes the stories seem silly, right? Or out there, or, outrageous. We're wondering, like, how did our ancestors even come up with these sort of things? But oftentimes there are usually a point, right? I've also even heard for um Siguapa as well as the La Diablesse that, sometimes they're used to like sort of curtail children's behaviors and make sure that they listen to their parents and like are not venturing out into the woods and all of these things, right? So there are really integral ways that, beyond just hearing the story, there are lessons, there are things to be taught for a lot of our people, and is particularly for probably older generations, right? That was maybe even necessary when you were considering that, many of the people who created these stories were under colonial rule, right? And are, hopefully trying to figure out ways to safeguard their families, their children, etc. And maybe these stories were just one of those ways as well.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I've been thinking a lot about that too, in terms of, not to go on a tangent here, but in terms of the way in which we are disciplined. Um, and without going into like extremes, even just like, oh, you have to behave, you have to be quiet, you have to act this way. I think somewhere down the line, the true intent was forgotten, right? So now it's almost like there's this rigidity about how you have to be, uh, and it has nothing to do with the original intent, which was protection.
slightly shifting from that point because you made a point earlier when you were, we're talking about maroons, we're also talking about the Taino. And so I definitely do want to ensure that we're making space to talk about the fact that not all of these stories, because obviously the Caribbean is a varied place, right? Or there are witch stories in like Salem, Massachusetts or whatever, right? So it's not to say that,
Yeah.
one size fits all thing, but there are some people who believe exclusively that, black and brown myths are merely just sort of like mirroring or overflowing from some of these white narratives. And so as we're obviously paying homage to and talking about the black influences of these stories, as I even mentioned with the Nancy, of course, the Taino, and knowing the histories of our regions that we do know, what do you say to those who think that these are just, mere sort of interpretations of white stories?
Yeah, I would say that it is, especially when pop media uh, does not represent us. And, now we do have moments of incredible representation like The Little Mermaid. But especially as Black and Brown women, we don't have visible archetypes as little girls for us to consider ourselves, for us to feel seen, right? And I think sometimes in feeling seen, we feel like we exist. So when we don't see ourselves, there's a part of us that gets lost. I feel like I'm going really deep here, but this is part of like my own personal journey of like reconnecting with myself and reconnecting with my inner child, being back in Santiago, right, my hometown. Um, yeah, but I think in these myths we really do capture ourselves, and we are able to tell stories of ourselves where we are beautiful, where we are powerful, where we are strong, where we are like scary too, right? It's not all about being beautiful, but where we are within the spectrum of human emotion. So we can be heroes, we can be villains, we can be um, creatures who fight for their emotions to be valid. And when I think of the stories that we tell of ourselves in the Caribbean, stemming from Black and Brown stories, right now the image that came to mind is La Llorona in Mexico, right? Which is not Caribbean, I know. So with La Llorona, like many myths, there are different versions of the story. But the version that I have heard, and I'm not Mexican, I haven't done a lot of research on this. But again, myth making is like this, right? It is, oral tradition and hearsay. But what I have heard about La Llorona is that she is this woman that roams the woods crying loudly, perhaps stealing children. Talk about that cautionary tale we were discussing, because she lost her own children. So that's the story. But to me, that is such a wonderful representation, nonetheless, of a mother's pain, right? The sort of like brown woman's pain. And when I think of La Ciguapa that we were just talking about, I have started to consider myself seen in the story of La Ciguapa as someone who is trying to live in the Dominican Republic while maybe not adhering to a certain standard of what womanhood is. And not to go on a tangent, but there is an academic paper that I did quote in that first episode of Radio Místico, all about how the Ciguapa is also about queer representation, because she diverges from the perceptions of womanhood, right? So I actually think is the opposite. I think is the opposite. I think whiteness doesn't even need to be in the room. And that's what makes these myths really wonderful.
I think that point is one that I haven't even necessarily fully reflected on in the fact, particularly for, more marginalized communities within our communities, right? How these myths become a place of feeling seen and heard and understood and empowered, and just a variety of things, right? It brought me to the fact that, um, apart from just knowing a lot of varied stories in folklore, there are quite a few of the characters in our folklore that are women, right? And so I don't know if that has necessarily come up in sort of like a point of analysis in your research or anything at all, but have you thought through a little bit what sort of the gendered formats or, why maybe that might be? And obviously, as we've said, right, that might not be the same throughout all of the region, but one thing that came to mind.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I probably am a little biased to women's stories because I know there are also a lot of stories of men, but my instinct right now is telling me to say that I think men are allowed much more freedom. So, hearing about a man who maybe roams the woods at night barefoot doesn't sound as crazy as hearing about a woman who roams the woods at night barefoot. So maybe there is a little bit to that. Maybe there's a little bit to, these myths capture stories of a time when we were much more connected to earth and we were allowed to be connected to earth as women. And yeah, it's that's an interesting question.
Or even highlighting the fact that, to your point of, men having more freedom at one point than women, right? It does seem scarier or, less representative, right? To hear these stories of like La Ciguapa. I think what I'm trying to say is it might even be like a marker of um how gendered stereotypes or, you know, those things even have been represented in the past, right? The fact that, La Ciguapa being a woman out in the woods whenever this story was created, right, seems so daunting to people for that time, right? Just based off maybe some of the ways that gendered stereotypes came about or, gendered norms even really is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And, something that's coming to mind when it comes to gender is religion and, Afro-diasporic spiritual practices and how they have each in each region. Again, this is like another example, right? I mean, for this it is a little different because it also has to do with syncretism and basically how these spiritual practices were protected within every different region ended up manifesting a whole new story, a whole new different practice that still has a lot of similarities as well, but also a lot of differences that need to be respected, right? So, for example, with 21 divisions here in Dominican Republic, which is Dominican voodoo, and it has a lot in similarity with Haitian voodoo, it has representation of different archetypes of men and women. And when I think of like the male archetypes and the male characters, there's tricksters, there are uh, sort of the old man with the cane, there's the superhero, right, with the sword. And then with women, there is also all of this room for representation as well of different sides of women. There's, the woman who's a bit flirty and a teenage flirty sort of character. There is someone who is perhaps a little more sexual. There's someone who's more of a mother figure. There's someone who's more of a dominatrix. I think, when I think of these, I do notice that like we also are kidding ourselves if we pretend that in Caribbean culture, women are also not free in many ways too. Like I feel like what I've noticed, at least in the Dominican Republic, is that perhaps there is a lot of internalized patriarchy in the mind, but in the way in which we live and move in our bodies, it's very liberated. And when I look at Caribbean culture in general, I think that is the case. When we look at, carnival, dancing, just the freedom that people have when they walk down the street. And yeah, so I just want to mention that because even though, these myths, they do capture patriarchal sentiments, I also do think that Black Caribbean women also do hold on to a lot of freedoms. It's like a paradox.
Definitely, definitely. We mentioned this is a side point, but we mentioned it a few times. I definitely do want to give our listeners, a moment to hear a little bit more about Radio Místico and, definitely check us out. So tell us a little bit more about your podcast as well and what inspired you to start it.
Yeah, so my podcast Radio Místico, it's all about myths and legends in the Caribbean and all across Latin America in Spanish. It's a podcast that I started, to capture these stories and to try to capture them from a place that embraces our blackness and embraces our brownness because it is necessary in Spanish speaking spaces. It is necessary in Latine, quote unquote, Latina spaces. And I, beyond that, I'm also fascinated by these stories, which is why I decided to do it. And the episodes have been a journey, every single one of them. So we did an episode on La Ciguapa. There's an episode on El Susto, which is a moment of fright where your spirit leaves your body after experiencing trauma. But the word susto is like very ubiquitous and is used very loosely. And yet it also has like this very spiritual meaning. So that was a wonderful, beautiful episode. And I've only shared so far about 6 episodes, but I am working on the second season, or rather the continuation of the first season, starting September 15. And for that one, I am trying to have a little bit more fun. And, instead of just focusing on Caribbean stories, I want to tell these stories from a Caribbean perspective. So the very first episode is going to be on aliens and UFOs and UFO sightings, which happen way too often. It's another one of those where it's like, how the heck do I capture this? Everybody in the Caribbean has a UFO story, but maybe that's the story.
I think so. I
Yeah,
mean, there are so many different people you could even ask, right? Um,
exactly.
Different voices that could capture that and just also highlight the variation, right? Like the different ways that they're told and what that says about us as well. So wonderful. So yeah, listeners, definitely check out Radio Místico. Um, Continuation of season 1 will be out in September. All right,
Yeah.
last question, final question. I might be able to guess. So our community knows I'm always looking for, new additions for the Strictly Facts sound segments, whether that be music or songs, etc. And so I'm asking you my favorite question, but with a twist. What is one of your all-time favorite Caribbean myths? And what is an example of how that myth shows up in contemporary Caribbean popular culture?
Yes. Well, I am ready to surprise you because I actually wanted to mention zombies.
Ah, okay. Go for it. Go
Yes.
for it. I'm ready.
Yes. Well, I'm fascinated by zombies because they originated in Haiti and there's different versions of I'm sure you've touched on this in the podcast, in your podcast.
No, I haven't yet because this is the first part of our myths and legends segment. So feel free to talk about it a little bit more before you give your um pop culture reference.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Well, zombies, the myth of zombies originated in Haiti. And the idea is that people's spirit left their bodies when they were enslaved so that only the body stayed. And this was a way in which people achieved freedom, right? They basically left their bodies. And Zora Neale Hurston was one of the first people, an anthropologist, to do research on this. I do have Haitian friends that criticize her because they say that she was a little bit ethnophobic. Is that the word? That she was a little bit like, simplistic and giving into stereotypes when telling this story. But if you look up pictures of real zombies, the photo that comes up was taken by her, which is fascinating. One of the stories that comes up. And, I wanted to bring this up today in today's podcast because I feel like zombies are one of the biggest phenomenon of American pop culture and movies, right? So from Michael Jackson's music video to The Walking Dead, zombies are just everywhere. And, there was a moment in American filmmaking where they were like the big thing, right? Where everybody was making zombie movies. And I don't think Haiti was given its props for that. And not even, beyond its props, it's such a powerful myth to consider this, right? To consider that this is the origin of where zombies come from. It's not just you get injected and you become a monster, but it was, again, this form of myth making as a way of liberating yourself. At the same time, that is not the only interpretation of zombies in Haiti. So I do invite folks to check it out and see, what are some of the other stories and some of the other origin stories of zombies. But I always find that super fascinating because it just feels like it was appropriated by Americanism.
Which we
And it's
wouldn't
not an
be
American legend.
right. We would not be surprised if that was the truth at all. But is there a particular book or song or movie that you think really epitomizes the story of zombies in the Caribbean?
Unfortunately, I owe you that one. I do. I owe you that one.
Not a problem. Not a problem.
Yeah, yeah. I think for me, the little bit that was fascinating was reading about Zora Neale Hurston, sort of studying this, only because I really admire her as a writer, and then seeing that she was also an anthropologist. It was one of those moments where it was like, oh, okay, and I'm making a podcast. So it's not that crazy that people can be writers and poets and be fascinated by local stories.
That's a great point. Zora Neale Hurston is actually the author of one of my favorite novels, Their Eyes Are Watching God. But I think the book you're thinking of is Tell My Horse, Voodoo and Life in Haiti and Jamaica, which chronicles her anthropological experiences, as you said, on the islands during the 1950s. I'll add another book for listeners to check out on one of my favorite myths and legends, and that's on the legend of the Sukoyant. And so Dr. Giselle Anatol's book, The Things That Fly in the Night, Female Vampires in Literature of the Circum-Caribbean and African Diaspora, focuses on the tale of the Sukoyant, or the Old Hag, or Old Hag rather, as some people know it as, and the presence of this story in the English and French speaking Caribbean, as well as other parts of the African diaspora, and how the tale of this female vampire highlights some of the very things we've been speaking about in this episode today. So, whether that be things like the resistance of colonial practices and narratives, the need for women's mobility, or, to discuss women's mobility in some instances, and of course, empowerment for these communities who were on multiple levels, of course, under colonial regime and writing their own stories. I think for now, though, that might bring us to the end of this really enjoyable episode. It was truly such a pleasure to have you on. I'm sure that we will continue to do crossovers and things in the future with all things Caribbean history and heritage and folklore. So it was really great having you, Amanda. I'm so thankful that you joined us.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm super happy that I was able to do this, especially in preparation for the release of my own, new season. I feel like this is very affirming. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Yes. And so for our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode. Of course, also be sure to check out Amanda's podcast, Radio Mystical, when the new season drops in September. And, as always, support Strictly Facts, whether that be, sending us a nice little donation. That would be always lovely. But also sharing it, listening, leaving us a rating and review. Sharing on social media is always, we love that too as well. So, we hope you enjoyed this episode a little more. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.